Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is Max. Hope you're all doing well today. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about the power of personality type. If you are interested in inner work, if you are interested in individuation or the psychology of Carl Jung or any kind of philosophy, you've probably brushed up against this idea, or if not, are already somewhat familiar with it. Personality type theory. You may well have come across things like 16 personalities or Myers-Briggs. A lot of corporate organizations now, and for many years, have been using these systems to understand their employees, to help their employees understand themselves and to understand each other, ostensibly. That's the aim anyway. And also, I've found it a very powerful tool in my own life and in my own work. So I am qualified as a type professional, and I use it in my own method, the Make It Conscious method as well, building on it and using more of a Jungian approach than a Myers-Briggs approach in some subtle ways there, which I'll come on to. So as I said in a recent video as well, like this is one of the tools that has stood the test of time for me in my work, and not only because it helps you to understand your workings better, how it is that you're different from other people and where indeed you might be similar to other people, but it also helps you make sense of them by the same token, really. And crucially, the part that maybe hasn't been explored sufficiently in some of the more the systems that the corporate organizations use, and that is how it serves as a development roadmap. And what we're seeing, I think, in the wider world here is these systems are facing a lot of problems in the organizational world, but they're seeing an increased interest in the consumer world by individuals themselves, seeing them as a development tool. And that's a trend that's been happening for many years, and one that I think will reach its end kind of soon. But there's some pretty interesting reasons for all of that, which I'll come on to. Today, though, I want to introduce you to personality type, talk about how I use it, and talk about how you might be able to make sense of yourself better using typology, and understand what this means for your own inner work, your own shadow work, and the things you can do to actually reconcile your own conflicts and to make the unconscious conscious. So I have built a test. It's a new kind of test, It shares a lot of similarities with what you might have seen before, but also differs in some key ways. So if you're interested to know your type and your functional combination, check out makeitconscious.com/PDA. The free test there, you can do it. There's also the option of a paid report as well, but the test itself is free. So to that end, let's talk about personality type. What this boils down to, the reason it works and the reason there's a formula to it is because it describes the fundamental ways in which your mind works. And so firstly, your mind does two things. It receives information, or it learns about the world and itself, and it also does something with that information. It makes decisions, or it judges that information or what to do with it. So it perceives and it judges. Furthermore, each of those divides into two other modes of operating. So it either receives concrete sensory data on one hand, or it perceives meaning and pattern and implicit information. So that's sensing and intuition. And then likewise for judging, there's two ways in which your mind can make decisions. You can either abstract and make meaning, and thinking about it in terms of symbols, that's thinking. And likewise, it can value it, that's feeling. It can draw a feeling-based judgment about what it's perceiving. So therefore, you have these four functions, and each of those can also be used both inwardly or in an introverted way or in an extroverted way. That's A, right? So it's really simple. So this is a theory that Carl Jung pulled together in his collected work 6, a piece called Psychological Types, built out his theory. And he did a load of research. If you want to go and read it, it's quite a long read, but he talks about all the historical attempts at something like this, all the observations that have come before. Bear in mind, he was a physician, he was a psychiatrist as well. And he was really trying to understand, firstly, what led people to lose their minds, to seek help, like medical help, not just the kind of help that we all need at some point, which is how to actually understand ourselves and how to grow. But the less fortunate of us have had to go and actually see a doctor at some point. And that's where Carl Jung really focused his professional career, at least. So to help people understand where their mind might have become imbalanced. And a natural consequence of that also is to know how your mind can develop. And that applies to everybody, because all of our minds follow the same fundamental metaphysical principles around energy, around duality, around the need to reconcile and iron out contradiction, become whole. So the theory applies to every mind that exists: your mind, my mind, everybody's, your spouse, your children, your parents. And so he delineated these 8 what are known as cognitive functions. These are ways of perceiving and ways of judging. And it's a very clear formula based on those 8 functions that I just described. They subdivide one additional time based on the combination in which those appear. And that gives rise to these 16 personality types. So you've got 2 ways of operating: judging, perceiving. They subdivide into 2 ways of operating as well: thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition. And they subdivide into the attitude or the orientation, so inwardly or outwardly, introverted or extraverted. And that also divides down again into the combination that each individual uses. So each of us has an inbuilt preference for all of those things: introversion, extroversion, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition. And this is really important as well, because one of the first things that Jung talks about is this introversion, extroversion dimension. And in fact, he coined those phrases. So this is really about where you get your energy. Do you get it on your own, inwardly, recharging by focusing on your inner world? Or do you get it with the external world, often with other people, but also the objects of the world as well? So how do you regard parties, for example? We can all enjoy a party, right? But would you find a party relaxing? That's a different question. Would you find it a way to recharge your energy? Would you happily party 24/7 for the rest of your life? Well, not even a hardcore extrovert could do that. I'm imagining, like, if any of you have seen the character Disco Stew from The Simpsons, imagine a bit like that. Even he reaches his limit eventually. But does it fire you up or does it drain you? It's a very different question from whether you enjoy it or not, whether you like other people, whether you enjoy other people's company. So that's a really key dimension there. But you can see how this breaks down into 16 types. So let's go to a quote directly from Jung, because that's really important in this work, is to see what the originators of such things actually said. As soon as you start doing that in psychology and philosophy, you see just how quickly things go off the rails when people don't go to the original authors. So Carl Jung wrote in Psychological Types, sensation, that's the function of sensation, establishes what is actually present. Thinking enables us to recognize its meaning. Feeling tells us its value. And intuition points to possibilities as to whence it came and whither it is going in a given situation. In this way, we can orient ourselves with respect to the immediate world as completely as when we locate a place geographically by latitude and longitude. The 4 functions are somewhat like the 4 points of a compass. They are just as arbitrary and just as indispensable. Right, so it's like finding your positioning on the psychic map of knowing how it is your preferences are geared towards perceiving the world and making decisions in the world. And it seems no coincidence, therefore, that previous systems to Jung and also ancient symbolism often indicated this. Michael Tsarian, not that long ago, said that there's nothing in Jung that isn't already present implicitly in the tarot. Likewise, the Christian cross, even certain other religious symbols that imply the number 4, if not express it directly. The Greeks had the 4 temperaments. That's also been built on in recent work by the likes of David Keirsey, or at least relatively recent. So Carl Jung is talking about 4 basic, irreducible functions of mind that also sit in opposition to each other. Because to understand something's meaning, there's a somewhat different exercise from understanding its value. Like thinking and feeling are dichotomous. Just the same thing with sensing and intuition. To understand where something is coming and going, that's a different exercise from understanding what it is right now in actualized reality. And so the two things can be reconciled, or they can be a million miles apart. And most people, much of us, for much of our lives, are in that position where our functional pairs, our way of operating in the world, is completely cut off from its opposite. So someone who's very, very logical and has never really dealt with feeling, has never tried to integrate feeling, is likely just to judge all feeling preference types as just completely irrational, right? And that may be true to some extent. Like there may be some who have the opposite problem where they're completely double down on feeling and just think that people with a thinking preference, by and large, are just cold and uncompassionate and just don't understand what really matters to people. So, like I say, a lot of us have this issue, and it's a first half of life issue typically, because psychologically speaking, to enter the second half of life and to go through it means reconciling with your opposites, reconciling with the shadow, not just the functional shadow, but also the shadow of complexes. So various ways in which you see yourself and the persona and so on. So it's a slightly different issue to personality, but it's related and it follows the same principle. So that's the aim of the game here, is to understand those differences and to actually work through them, reconcile with your opposites. But let's go next to a quote by Isabel Briggs Myers. And so she, in 1980, in the preface to her book, wrote, "I hope parents, teachers, students, counselors, clinicians, clergy, and all others who are concerned with the realization of human potential may find a rationale for many of the personality differences they encounter in their work or must deal with in their private lives." So she was coming at it with a slightly different intention to Jung, although certainly overlapping. Different because she really intended it to be used wide scale by everybody, as did Jung, but she actually applied it beyond just the medical context. And also because she's primarily concerned with differences between people. And there's an interesting letter between Jung and Catherine, where Jung basically says, I'll have to talk about this some other time, but implies that Catherine is not really looking beyond mere quality. So if you're familiar with my shadow map model, you'll know the difference between quality, quantity, and direction. And what Jung is basically saying is not everything can be put down to quality. A lot of it's also direction. Human beings, in his words, might be 50% devil, right? So don't just assume that if two people can't get on, it's merely because, one's a thinker and one's a feeler. It's not always that simple. Not only is it not always that simple, but it's also a moral matter as well. But many modern shadow workers won't tell you that because they're still working off this sort of everyone's essentially nice idea, which maybe there's something in that, but that there is no such thing as evil or the misuse of free will. So it's clear here that Isabel Briggs Myers is really just looking for a way to understand each other, for people to understand each other. And that's vital. There's no doubt that's been incredibly useful and had such an impact on the world of psychology, the application of psychology in organizational contexts, and also for individuals for a number of years. So just giving credit where credit's due there. And so why actually study type? Well, I remember when I first came across Jungian type in, I think it was 2011, it really made an impact on me. And before that, I understood how I was different in some kind of sense, but I didn't really have any of the external body of knowledge to call upon to really build on and make sense of. So first thing really is it simply helps you make sense of yourself. And if you happen to be in one of the more minority camps here, because it's not an equal distribution amongst all types, not even close. So generally speaking, intuitives are a little bit rarer than sensors. We don't necessarily know the exact proportion. Some people think it's about 2-to-1 sensors to intuition, but it really depends on the context and where you're measuring it and who you're asking, the kind of people that sign up for a test. It's pretty clear that although many sensation types are interested in type, they are outnumbered by the intuitives in this particular conversation. And that makes sense, right? I mean, intuitives are more interested in psychology generally, of making meaning of things, of understanding how things are connected together. So it helps you make sense of yourself in the world and make sense of others. And of course, this, to Myers and Briggs's point, it really helps you understand the difference between, okay, what is a mere preference and what is actually a misdirection of free will. Because there's a whole question of type compatibility there. Maybe that's a conversation for another episode, but it's a tricky subject, that type compatibility, because there's a lot more to be said for responsibility and empathy than there is about type, I would say, in the long term. But nonetheless, it's really important to understand your differences, not just for sake of empathy, because it does support that, but also for collaboration, for your communication, understanding where they're coming from, communicating in a way that you can be understood. So that's all pretty standard stuff when it comes to personality. But lastly, there is, of course, understanding your development pathway, because it's going to look different for every individual. It's going to look different for every individual within a type category, within one of the 16 types. But it's most certainly going to look very different, for example, between an INTJ and an ESTP, or in my system, that would be known as the seer commander and the tactician sage. These two types, these two functional pairs, have very different priorities, at least initially, when it comes to development, and different things that they need to see and become aware of and integrate in order to really understand themselves at a holistic level, not least the world. So under the Make It Conscious method, I've actually formulated a system that you can use to take your type and understand what your meaning pathways are. In other words, your growth priorities are what it actually involves for you. And so there are 6 of them, at least as they pertain to personality. There's more as they pertain to your persona and your symbolic aspects as well. But this is the starting point. This is ground zero, really. So anyone who's serious about understanding themselves, who has suffered a great deal in life and really wants to understand why and where they sit within it all, this is a very powerful place to start with personality type. It doesn't answer everything, but it gives you a very useful framework for understanding where the various moving parts might fit in. So a bit more about my approach then, the Make It Conscious method. So firstly, I looked at all of this. I looked at the work of Myers and Briggs, and I've got many friends and colleagues in the industry, and talked to them and understood some of their concerns as well about the application of type, not just how well it works, not just how well it's being adopted by the wider world, but also its theoretical soundness. There's a lot of disagreement and concern about this, because what Jung did and what Myers-Briggs did is they kind of went in slightly different directions in some ways. And so, long story short, Jung was all about these cognitive functions that I described, these 8. I'm going to talk about them all in a few moments, but Myers and Briggs weren't really about that so much. And yet a lot of the personality development and personal development content out there relies on these quite heavily. So the 4-letter code you might be familiar with, like the INTJ, the INFP, this kind of thing, that's really useful for understanding your preferences. But it doesn't tell you explicitly what that means about how your mind actually operates and what it is actually doing. So I've tried to make this a lot more easy to understand by simply giving the functions names. Now, other people have done that too. Personality Hacker guys have done that. I know that Susan Storm at Personality Junkie has also done that in her own way. Dario Nardi's done it. Many people have got their own nomenclature for the 8 functions. I've taken a slightly different approach by giving them character names, so almost something kind of archetypal. So, for example, the introverted intuition function is known as the seer. Extroverted feeling is known as the caregiver. And so this makes them recognizable as characters, which, when you bring in something like active imagination, becomes very useful, because now you can actually work with them symbolically. So they have a lot of parallels with the archetypes. They're not strictly the same, because, well, on one level, these are more kind of qualitative. They lead in a certain direction. They exist in antithesis to something else. Whereas an archetype is more like the equivalent of a complex. It sits in the unconscious, the collective unconscious, that is, and feeds into all of our experiences. Whereas the functions are more unilateral in their appearance, or at least they should be, depending on how well developed they are. But the beautiful thing about, say, intuition is that actually you can't really intuit without sensing. You can't really think without feeling. So any degree of thinking, to any useful degree, is kind of determined by how well it integrates feeling on some level. everything has to become split off and one-sided in order to develop. Jung was very clear about this. The thinkers that came before him, the idealists, were very clear on this as well. But in the end, mature thinking includes feeling and vice versa. So that's just a bit about the functions there. But to make this really simple and understandable, I give them names. And so, for example, if you are an INFP, well, I would also call that the lover explorer, because your first function is the lover, that's introverted feeling, and your second function is the explorer, that's extroverted intuition. So rather than trying to remember the code, like how does INFP or ENTJ, how does that relate to the functions? You don't need to work that out. You just know that your type is your double-barreled functional name, like lover explorer or sage tactician or whatever it might be. So a second unique angle here is that I incorporate this with shadow work and my shadow map model. So I can map every function according to the shadow map, and I'll show you that in just a few moments. The third part is the meaning pathway. So how this opens up a pathway to development. Now, of course, others have done this as well. I take my own unique approach. As I mentioned, there are 6 meaning pathways for each type because there's 3 for each function. This is all going to become clear. And then I actually assign practices for how to integrate those. So using my 7 habits of individuation model, I align that to the functions. I've actually got a matrix that I'll show you soon where you can line up various practices with each function so you can know exactly what it is you can do to integrate that function and also bring in some of its opposite. And lastly here, something that's really important because this just cannot be ignored in today's world, and that is the development of technology and not least AI. So we're in a distinctly human conversation here. Like, what is it that a human can do for themselves and in the world? And well, in the modern working world, you can't really talk about humans without talking about AI and vice versa, because AI is fundamentally changing the role of the human in the workplace. It's reflecting back what is distinctly human and what isn't. What is it that humans have been doing that arguably was really something that was quite mechanical and can potentially be replaced or augmented and supplemented using AI? So it's really causing humans to differentiate. And so I thought it's very important that we have a conversation around how each type specifically can use AI, because that's not the same, not even close to the same for every type. Someone who leads with feeling is going to use AI in a very different way to someone who leads with thinking. An INFP or a lover explorer is going to use that very differently to a ENTJ or someone who leads with the commander extroverted thinking function. So then, 5 ways there in which the Making Conscious method is differentiating, but also, well, I think offering it in a way that is needed in many places right now, because in the world of organizational development, a lot of the straight up Myers-Briggs based systems aren't seeming to get as much traction as they used to. They used to be everywhere, and now people feel they can just do a test online and get a profile. But a lot of these veteran type consultants will tell you that it must not stop there. This is not just about getting a profile. It's understanding, well, what does that mean? How do I therefore not only use that in my work? That's the first kind of place to go afterwards. But what does that mean for me in my growth? What does that mean for what I should be focusing on in my development as an adult human? Adult development is of utmost importance right now. Many of the problems that are being experienced in the commercial world, in the environment, socially, economically, these are quite simply the result of one-sidedness of the personality, of not considering consequences, or of doubling down on an idea, whether it be GDP or profit or revenue. Great, nothing wrong with those things. We need all of those things. We need to boost all of those things, but not unilaterally without considering what else that implies, what that means. Because it's no good just boosting the economy 10 times if you destroy your environment and you ruin culture in the process. You could boost any of those numbers by an infinite amount and still have a horrible world to live in. So it's clearly not the only factor. Really at the heart of all this is this need to understand opposites and duality and to reconcile. So unless type is helping you to do that individually, I would question its value, really. It helped you kind of get to that point where you're thinking like that. But until that point, it's merely practical and pragmatic, and therefore has limited sustainable use. And so I'm attempting to reintroduce a bunch of things here that I think can be very relevant, not only relevant, but also get people over the hump where they're actually thinking more in a developmental sense and around shadow work. It's only a matter of time until organizations are thinking about that too, otherwise they just won't survive. So this episode so far has already gone on quite a bit longer than I thought it would for the intro, so I think I'm gonna have to divide it into two. But let me just give you a brief intro to the 8 functions here. Let's switch camera positions. So let's end on this. The 8 functions as identified by Jung, very simple and straightforward. As I said, or as he said really, and I'm just merely echoing like a parrot, there are 2 things your mind does. It either makes decisions or it perceives. It judges and it perceives, or it learns. Within those, each of those has 2 other ways of operating. So if we look at judging, first of all, you either make decisions through abstraction or through valuation, thinking and feeling. You don't only do it that way, but we each have a preference towards one of those. And certainly in early life, we tend to be almost one-sided. Nothing is entirely one-sided in this world. That's impossible. But it might just be that consciously you are almost practically virtually one-sided, and unconsciously there's a compensation going on. So abstraction, that's thinking. Valuation, that's feeling. Feeling in this sense is different from how I feel emotionally. That's actually a somewhat different thing. Feeling is more about valuation. It's almost a kind of knowing that something is good or bad, or at least a judgment that something is good and bad. Doesn't mean it's always accurate. So that's thinking and feeling. And then within that as well, you've got introverted and extroverted. So introverted thinking, I call that the sage, as indicated by this upright sword here. Introverted feeling, I call that the lover. It's like inwardly what matters to me subjectively. Extroverted thinking is the commander. Extroverted feeling is the caregiver. Right, over to perceiving now. So then likewise, perceiving can be in terms of what is concrete, like what is perceived by my senses, 5 of them. Actualized reality, what is in existence. And that can also be introverted and extroverted as well. Then you've got intuition. So think, what does that mean? If sensation is like explicit, actualized reality, then intuition quite clearly pertains to implicit, potential connection, meaning where things are going, but also what could be and what things mean. So explicit and implicit. This is why intuitives can often, sometimes we might describe it as psychic, and often what that is simply unconscious perception of something that they know and don't necessarily know how they know. They can't trace it back to a particular sensation or particular thing that happened. It's just, okay, I know this to be true. And sometimes they can retrace it, but maybe not with the kind of fidelity that someone with a sensing preference might describe something. So these, of course, likewise subdivide down into introverted and extroverted as well. And so, for example, introverted intuition, I've called the seer. That's understanding where things are going, where they've come from, just knowing things without knowing how you know. But then the extroverted intuition is more about making connections between things, usually in the world. So it tends to be more divergent in its approach, whereas the introverted is more convergent. And so for those on video, you'll see the various icons that we've developed here. And so for those of you interested in symbolism will also notice some familiar imagery here. So then, given that there are 8 functions and that each of us has a preference for each of those dimensions, the next thing to note is that each person has what Jung called a dominant function. So of these 8, you have one that you prefer over all others. If you're an introvert, this is going to be an introverted function. If you're an extrovert, this is going to be an extroverted function. Now, what that also means is there's also going to be a second function, one of two, which is known as your auxiliary. It's the thing that supports the dominant function. And this can only be one of two different functions. Now, some of the theory is a bit disputed on this, but basically the reason for that is it has to be in the opposite orientation, right? No one is purely introvert or extrovert. So we each have an auxiliary function or a secondary function that is in the opposite direction. But also it cannot be of the same kind. So if you're a dominant judger, you cannot have an auxiliary judging function. It has to be perceiving. And so what this means is that there's actually only two functions that it can be. So for example, if you lead with the seer, introverted intuition, as I know that many of you do, well, you have two possibilities for your secondary auxiliary function. It's either going to be extroverted feeling, the caregiver, or extroverted thinking, the commander. So what this means, 8 functions, 16 types. Very simple. That is why you have the 16 personality types that we all know, maybe not all of us, but that many of us know well, and that has become very popular in recent years. So if you're not familiar with these types, don't worry. You may be vaguely familiar with terms like INFP or ENFJ or all of these types. All that's saying is this is indicating which is your preference in these 4-letter codes. Do you prefer introversion or extroversion? Sensing or intuition? Do you prefer thinking or feeling? Judging or perceiving? Let's not go too deep into that now. However, all I'll say is that this can be simplified greatly by simply describing the functions. This is how I do it in the Make It Conscious method. There's other reasons why you might want to do the 16 type model. That definitely has its place as well. And I mean, I use that too in my reports and the results that I'll share with you, because it's really important to know whether you have a preference for which function. But where it gets really powerful is where you start thinking about these functions as well. Beyond the first two, it starts to get a bit murky. It's not really clear if Jung thought of it in quite the way that a lot of people practice it in terms of the functions. But at least in terms of the dominant and auxiliary, and at least for our purposes, which is shadow work and development, this is a very useful model. And so for those of you watching on video, you'll see the breakdown here. You'll see terms like seer caregiver, stalwart caregiver, sage explorer, commander seer. This is simply saying dominant auxiliary. So simply stating what you lead with and what you back that up with. So with that said, I'm going to leave that there for now because there's so much more to say on all of this. If any of this is not clear, that's to be expected probably if this is your first time looking at it. Don't worry. It's not clear to anyone in the first half an hour of studying this stuff. But there are attempts made by me and others to, make this accessible, understandable. And there's a couple of things I'd suggest from here. So one thing you can do is, firstly, you can take a test if you don't know what your type is. And you're welcome to check out the test on makeitconscious.com/PDA. So you'll access the personality dynamics assessment there. And that'll give you an initial result. And beyond that, you can also work with these functions in active imagination. And you can do that by using these character names just as a bit of a steer or a seed for the practice. So this is a bit like meditation. If you're not familiar with active imagination, it's another invention of Jung, or at least a rediscovery by Jung. And it involves talking to your unconscious. And so by thinking of these functions as characters, this helps you to engage with them symbolically. So there's going to be exercises released over the next few weeks here pertaining to personality types. So you can do the test, discover your type, and then do the free exercise on YouTube or in the community. And then if you want to take it further, there's also what's called the Personality Alchemy Pack within Hestia for subscribed members. And so far that's a 7-day module where you actually work with your core functions in active imagination. But you've first got to know what they are. So that's what the PDA is for. With that said, I'll thank you for your time and attention. Look forward to discussing this further in the next episode. But for now, Thank you, and I shall speak to you soon.